Hi everyone, so this is going to be the second of our lessons for spring break, and this is going to be looking at the first three presidents that are going to be involved in the Cold War and kind of how they react to the Cold War and the increasing tensions that will exist between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, before we get to each of them individually, we're going to be looking at specifically how and where a lot of this fighting is going to be going on, and that's going to be in the Third World. So post World War II, there's going to be a lot of new nations that are going to be created. There's a lot of nationalism as well as kind of an anti-colonial movement, and so we're going to see as a result there kind of being new nations being created, which means that those nations are currently non-aligned. And so we are going to fight with the Soviet Union to try and align those nations. Now, what is a third world nation? Generally, these are nations in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. They are economically poor and politically unstable, generally because previous to this they had been controlled by a stronger nation. They generally lack education and technology. And like I said, this is going to be where the proxy wars are going to be fought between us and the Soviet Union for influence. We will actually end up oftentimes supporting repressive dictatorships rather than true democracies, simply because it will allow for the country to be stable and thus less likely to turn to communism. So we were more concerned about the spread of communism than we were for the benefit of the country itself. And we do this a lot of different times. For example, we helped depose the democratically elected Shah of Iran after he seized British oil properties, and we helped put in a repressive dictator there that will come back to bite us about 25 years later. So at the end of this unit, we'll see how that comes back to hurt us in the long run. In Guatemala, we used the CIA to organize a coup against the democratically elected nationalist leader, Jacobo Guzman, after he had seized land that had been owned by the American-owned United Fruit Company. We also would help plan a coup against Fidel Castro in Cuba that will come back to bite us as well, and we'll see that a little bit later on in this lecture today. So you can see that we use these as like pawns in the greater game of us versus the Soviet Union. So let's get to our very first president and how he relates to the Cold War. So the first president that we're going to be seeing involved in the Cold War is going to be President Harry S. Truman. And the main issue that he's going to be facing is going to be the spread of communism in Asia. The Chinese Civil War is going to begin in 1927 and will last all the way until 1950. They do kind of have a pause in this during the period of Japanese occupation during World War II, but for the most part it goes pretty much without hesitation between 1927 and 1950. It's going to be led by Chiang Kai-shek for the Democratic Nationalists, sometimes referred to as Jing Jie-shi, and the Communists are going to be led by Mao Zedong, sometimes referred to as Mao Zedong. Same guys, just different pronunciation. But this fight is not going to really interest the United States after World War II, despite the fact that we are afraid of the spread of communism. We're more focused on rebuilding the Philippines and Japan, and so we don't put as much effort towards the stop of this in China. Also, Chiang Kai-shek is not as strong of a leader as we were anticipating him to be or hoping that he would be, and so we also kind of started to pull back our support. And as a result of that, in 1950, the People's Republic of China is going to be established, that Mao Zedong and the communists will win, and they will create a brand new communist nation, and the nationalists would escape to Taiwan, where they would remain until today. Now, what is really concerning to us, though, is that almost immediately after they gained their independence, the PRC and the Soviet Union signed a treaty of friendship, which that's extremely concerning, just thinking of not only the sheer physical size of both of those countries, but the massive populations of both of those countries. And now they are both communist, and now they're BFFs. So that is extremely concerning to us. The other concern is about the United Nations. If you recall, the United Nations has a seat for China on the Security Council. It's a permanent seat. And the question was, which China should get the seat? And it comes down to the United States using its sway among the other leaders of the Security Council to give the seat to the nationalists in Taiwan. This not only upsets China, as you might expect, but it also is going to severely upset the Soviets. The Soviets, as a result of this, boycott the Security Council. Now keep that in mind for the next couple of minutes, because we're going to talk about how that comes back to bite them. And because we no longer really see China as an ally, because they are now communists and they're friends with the Soviets, we now put all of our focus on Japan as our new main Asian ally. Probably the biggest focus of Truman when it comes to the Cold War is going to be Korea. The Korean War is oftentimes referred to as the Forgotten War, and that is largely because it's bookended by these two massive wars, World War II and the Vietnam War. World War II is a very positive place in America's memory, and Vietnam clearly does not. And I think it's because of that Korea does get forgotten. It's also not a super long war. It only lasts for about 3 years, as well as it doesn't really have much of an interesting ending in the idea of wars. It doesn't have that clear victory like we had in World War II. So we're going to look at kind of why Korea was such a concern, and it all starts with the ending of World War II. So World War II ends, and we divide up Korea. Korea had been controlled by Japan, and so we divide it after the war is over. We divided at the 38th parallel, where the United States would take control of the southern portion, and the Soviet Union would back the northern portion. They would have the plan that they would rebuild, and then we would bring the nation back together again in about 10 years after they had been rebuilt, and the people would get to vote on what kind of government they wanted. Hopefully this sounds familiar. Sounds just like Germany. And you probably remember how well that worked out in Germany. So I'm pretty sure you know exactly how well it's going to work out in Korea. And it does not seem to work out very well. North Korea, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, is going to invade South Korea in 1950. And within just 2 months, he is able to control pretty much the entire peninsula. So Syngman Rhee, the leader of South Korea, begs the United Nations for assistance. Now, I'll explain this little GIF that's over on the side here in just a moment. But what we're going to see is that the United Nations is kind of for the first time going to have a real role of keeping the peace around the world. Now, when this happens, the United States and many, many other nations come together as a coalition to protect South Korea. They are going to be led by General Douglas MacArthur. Now, what ends up happening is that MacArthur is going to launch a surprise attack at Incheon, which is on the west coast near Seoul. And that is going to help push the North Koreans back. So I'm going to wait till this kind of comes back to its start here, and then I'll explain how this works. So we start here in 1950. In 2 months, the North Koreans are able to push down to the very bottom of South Korea. They are all the way down here within just a couple of months. Within just a couple more months after the attack by General Douglas MacArthur, though, he is able to push all the way up to the Chinese border. Now, the issue, though, there was that when he passed the 38th parallel, he was no longer just defending South Korea. He was now invading North Korea, and that became an issue all on its own. But China, now seeing these UN forces marching towards their border, gets very, very concerned when we are all the way up the Yalu River. And so China starts to put together their military and sends their military into North Korea to help push back against this American influence. That is going to cause a major conflict between President Truman and General MacArthur on how to proceed. General MacArthur says there is no substitute for victory, of which President Truman is going to respond, look, we're trying to prevent a third world war, not start one. However, MacArthur, as we well know, doesn't do anything halfway, and so MacArthur goes to Congress and goes to the press. He basically goes over his boss's head, because remember, Truman is the commander-in-chief, and MacArthur is demanding that we nuke China for interfering in this war. And Truman doesn't want that to happen, and because MacArthur went ahead and went above President Truman's head, he was forced to fire him for insubordination. We would continue on with this war at the 38th parallel for the next 3 years, and it becomes a war of attrition where neither side is really winning. We just kind of keep going back and forth across that 38th parallel, and we're just losing a lot of men. When this is all going to end up, an armistice will be called in July of 1953. By the time that that is done, there are over 5 million soldier and civilian deaths. And when we end it, as you kind of saw in that picture, it ends pretty much exactly where it started, just only kind of diagonal across the 38th parallel. And to prevent against any further aggression during the time where we're trying to put together the peace treaty, we create the DMZ, the Demilitarized Zone. But do not let that name fool you. It is the most highly militarized place on the planet. This narrow strip of land is supposed to be a buffer between North and South Korea while we're making the peace treaty. Unfortunately, however, there is no peace treaty. It never got made. North Korea refused to continue the peace talks, and as a result, the war never officially ended. So technically in 2017, the Korean War is still going on. Now, that makes it very difficult for us because we need to make sure that North Korea does not begin to attack South Korea, who we have vowed to defend. Now, why the Korean War is significant, despite the fact that it kind of ended exactly where it began. First of all, it is the first military engagement in the Cold War. We have a lot of times where we are fighting against the Soviets diplomatically, we are fighting against them technologically, like the arms race. This is the first time that we are actually fighting against communism itself in the Cold War. And then the second reason is that we see that containment is now going to be utilized outside of Europe, and that is going to kind of create America's foreign policy as being a worldwide policy. Now, what happens after the war? Well, you can see the difference between North and South Korea in these two pictures right here. Why is there such a distinct difference? In the two pictures, on the left-hand side, you have the capital city of Seoul in South Korea, and then on the right-hand side, you have the capital city of Pyongyang in North Korea. So why is that so starkly different? Well, South Korea, first of all, adopts democracy. They have a democratic constitution. They establish free elections. In the 1980s and 1990s, they have the largest economic expansion in the entire world, and that's largely due to their focus on technology. Computer parts and computer programming and software is all going to be built in South Korea, as well as they get into the auto industry. And what we'll see at the end of this unit is how American foreign policy mistakes in the Middle East are going to lead to Americans buying a lot of Asian-built cars, like Toyotas and Hyundais. Now, the final thing that kind of goes along with their success is the fact that they didn't really have to worry about anything militarily. The United States remained there since 1953 to protect South Korea. So because they didn't really have to focus as much energy on protecting themselves from North Korea, they could put a lot of their efforts into improving the lives of the people in their own country. And that's why they have been able to rebuild so significantly. It's also because they are part of a group called SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. It's exactly like NATO. Their whole goal is to protect against the spread of communism in Southeast Asia and protect democracy there. It's kind of interesting, though, because SEATO, most of the countries that are part of it, first of all, aren't even in Southeast Asia. For example, it is made up of the United States, France, Great Britain, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Pakistan. And they organized that in 1954, just a year after the end of the Korean War. And so this international organization has also helped South Korea kind of stay together and protect themselves. Now, North Korea, what happened there? Well, they adopted communism, and just like most communist nations, they focused on heavy industry and collectivizing farms. They focused on militarization, and they will look at nuclear power as a way to protect themselves. And this is going to be done through the first and only communist dynasty, and that is the Kim family. It starts off with the first leader of North Korea, and that is the communist revolutionary Kim Il-sung. He's going to be the one that puts together these collectivized farms and heavy industry and so on and so forth. When he dies in 1994, power is going to go to his son, Kim Jong-il. Now, Kim Jong-il is going to really focus on creating what we call a cult of personality between himself and his father. He wants to make sure that the people of his country not only support communism, but that they support the leadership unquestioningly. These people are creating themselves in the images of gods in North Korea. And to do this, he is going to paint the West and paint outsiders as being the reason for North Korea struggling, that this is why we have to put all of our money towards the military to protect ourselves from these outsiders. This is why we're not going to, have enough money to, open more schools or whatever, because we need to protect ourselves from these democratic aggressors. And so Kim Jong-il is going to put a lot of the country's money into developing nuclear technology. He died in 2011, and he would be succeeded by his son, who is Kim Jong-un, the current leader of North Korea. Kim Jong-un is probably a little bit crazier than his father, and that's partially because he's trying to not only live up to the cult of personality created by his father and his grandfather, but also because there is a lot of concern that he would be too soft on the West, because he actually grew up in the West. He went to a boarding school in Switzerland, like the most democratic, the most like Western place you could pretty much think of. And so he has recently launched ICBMs and is threatening warfare against South Korea. And so this is a current threat that we are continually watching as a fear that we could see the Korean War begin again. Now, because all of their money and efforts are going towards the military and protecting against these Western aggressors, the problem is that the country struggles with shortages of energy and food. Even in the capital city of Pyongyang, they cannot seem to keep the lights on. They cannot feed their people. And even today, 2017, there are still issues of famine in North Korea. You can see also just these struggles in the following image. Here is a satellite image of the Korean peninsula at night. And it is very easy to spot where the capital city of South Korea is. But it's also equally easy to find the capital city of North Korea because it's the only one that has any light. And that is because it's really the only place that any light is available, that all of their energy, both literal and figurative, is placed in the capital city of Pyongyang. Now, as far as the DMZ today, the place that you see here is the most dangerous place on the planet. The side that you're kind of sitting on is North Korea, and then you are looking at South Korea. So South Korea is over here, North Korea is over here. And why this is so incredibly dangerous is because this is where they have tried to create a place where the two sides can come together and discuss and make deals. These bunkers that you see over on the sides, they have openings on both sides, meaning that both the South Koreans and the North Koreans can go into these cabins and they can meet in the middle and in this kind of neutral area and have discussions. Unfortunately, that virtually never happens. North Korea does not like to talk to South Korea. But what also makes it so dangerous is because the only thing that is actually separating North from South Korea is this little line right here, this little concrete barrier. Now, these 3 North Korean soldiers are there to protect against anyone defecting to South Korea. The gentleman that you see in the foreground, his job is to look forward, to make sure nobody is going to try and run past him and jump across the border. The other 2 men are there just in case somebody does get past the first guard. But why they are facing each other is because they want to make sure that neither one of them decides to step over the border and defect into South Korea. Gives you an idea of just how bad your country is when you're afraid that your own military is going to actually try and defect. So if you've got your president's chart out, you've got some information for Harry Truman, and some of these things clearly we haven't gotten to yet. We'll get to them in this key period, and so a lot of this will make sense later. He is going to be in office from 1945 to 1943. His nickname he actually earned when he was in World War I, and that was "Give 'em hell, Harry." He was a Democrat because clearly he was part of FDR's administration. The major events that happened under him: he's going to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He's going to be there for the creation of the United Nations, for the Nuremberg trials, for the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, for the Taft-Hartley Act, which we'll talk more about in another class, for the treaty that creates NATO, the Korean War, which we just discussed. The 22nd Amendment will be ratified, which we'll talk about in another class as well, and the detonation of the H-bomb. So our next president is going to be Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose nickname is Ike, and he has the great campaign slogan of "I like Ike." We'll talk more about his campaign and how that was run in another class. We're going to focus more on how he deals with the Cold War. And surprisingly, one of the things that he does dealing with the Cold War is actually going to be done here at home, and that's going to be the passage of the Federal Highway Act. Now, the Federal Highway Act is going to allow for the building of the interstate highway system. So that's all the ones that you see that have the blue shield, like the I-5, the I-15, the I-10. And the purpose was to allow military vehicles to move quickly across the country in the event of a national emergency. This was actually inspired by his time during World War II when he saw the German Autobahn. And it's going to have way bigger reactions and way bigger results than even just this kind of military protection. First of all, it allows for the much more efficient distribution of goods. We're going to be able to have materials passed across the United States much faster than ever before. It's going to basically replace the railroads in a lot of ways and make those products now cheaper to buy. It's also going to allow for suburbanization and urban sprawl. People are going to be able to live further away from where they work, and so they're going to move a little bit further and further outside of the urban cities. It's also going to allow for travel to be made easier and faster, and we're going to see kind of the effects of that in another class. But people are going to now put a lot of focus on traveling via car and enjoying that as kind of like the purpose of the trip is enjoying the car ride. And finally, that it does create a new road culture, which we'll delve into a lot more in another class. Now, this is just a little fun fact for you, something that's going to kind of be good for your life. The interstate highway system was very, very well structured and very much like the German Autobahn. And so anytime you see an even numbered interstate highway, it's going to be going from east to west. If you see an odd numbered interstate highway like the I-15, it's going to be going north and south. Now, the Federal Highway Act was hoping that money that was generated in the building of it in the saving of fuel and the saving of all of this could actually be utilized to build them up and kind of maintain these highways. Now, another thing that we see with Eisenhower in the Cold War, first of all, Stalin dies kind of mysteriously, and his right-hand man, who is Nikita Khrushchev, is going to take his place. the major event that happens for him kind of internationally is going to be the Suez Crisis. This was an invasion of Egypt in late of 1956 by Israel, and then it was followed up by the UK and France. And they were looking to try and gain control of the Suez Canal, which we've talked about before as in regards of World War II and how important that man-made canal was in cutting the time of shipping between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, which connects to the Indian Ocean. Basically, it allows you to completely bypass Africa. This was under the control of Egypt and their president, Gamal Nasser, and he was a nationalist president and was very much trying to get his people to be proud of their Egyptian heritage and to have control over Egypt and so on and so forth. And so this was pretty tense because the United States, on the one hand, wants to support our democratic allies, but on the other hand, it's kind of messed up and they don't really have a reason to try and take over that area, and so as a result, the United States is going to have to intervene. Surprisingly, so does the Soviet Union, and so for once, we're actually kind of fighting on the same side, and we urge, along with the United Nations, to get those countries to withdraw. It's pretty humiliating for Britain and France, and it just ends up strengthening the power of Nasser in Egypt. This is going to lead to the Eisenhower Doctrine, however. This was a statement in which the United States said that any Middle Eastern country could request American economic assistance or aid in order to secure and protect themselves from being invaded by an outside force. Essentially saying, hey, if you're afraid that, communists are going to try and come in and take over your country, call up the US, we'll give you money or we'll give you help so that you don't get taken over. The problem with this, however, and this idea is going to be put together by the American Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. The problem with this is that it basically increases the possibility of a war between the United States and the Soviet Union because we're both vying for those places in the Middle East. But the other thing that it does is that it actually ends up increasing the popularity of these nationalist leaders like Nasser. And so the United States is going to be in this really kind of awkward position. And this political cartoon kind of illustrates that really well. It says, but we, of course, are strictly non-colonial. And here you have in the front Eisenhower, in the middle is John Foster Dulles, and then behind that is the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon. And they're marching kind of with these militaries towards the Middle East. So we're saying oh, we'll come and help you, but we're not colonialists. We're not trying to gain control of your country. So there's definitely some issue there. And so that's going to be the end of what we look at for Eisenhower. So when we look at our president's chart for Dwight D. Eisenhower, he is in office from 1953 to 1961, and as I said, his nickname is Ike. He is a Republican, and the major events that happen under him is he is there for the ending of the Korean War. He's going to be there for the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement with the Brown versus Board of Education SCOTUS law. We have the Interstate Highway Act, the event of Little Rock 9, the Eisenhower Doctrine, as well as the admittance of Hawaii and Alaska into the Union, our last two states to be admitted to the Union. Finally, we get to Kennedy, and Kennedy's administration is going to be nicknamed Camelot, and I'll go into why that's called that in a future class. But just kind of think that he and his administration are seen in that very same kind of legendary, almost mythical way as Camelot is. So how Kennedy is going to respond to the Cold War is he's going to be different from Truman and Eisenhower, who have a policy of brinkmanship, willing to go to the brink of nuclear war in order to maintain peace. Kennedy is actually a fan of something called flexible response. He wants to increase traditional military spending and a little less on nuclear spending so that we can respond to a crisis using the appropriate type of weaponry. start off small and then work your way up to the nukes. Don't just start off with nukes and, think that's the only way that things can go anymore. And one of the ways that he was actually planning on doing this was kind of playing a long game. He was trying to, encourage nations around the world to not create situations where military intervention would be needed. And he was doing that through the Peace Corps. This was for young people, generally those that had either just graduated high school through just graduating college, people who had yet to kind of figure out what they're going to do with their lives as far as their careers. They would take a couple of years to join the Peace Corps, and they would go to various nations, mainly third world nations around the world, where they would provide technical assistance and help people in those areas improve their job skills and their economic skills so that they can bring more and better jobs to those devastated nations. He was also looking to help these nations understand American culture and also have Americans better understand the cultures of nations around the world. He felt that much of the problem of this East versus West was people not fully understanding exactly what Americans believed and what they stood for, and vice versa. As well as that it was going to help show third world countries that there were other options and there were better ways than communism. Even if maybe they weren't fully willing to go democratic, they didn't have to go communist, and that the United States would be willing to be the ones to put in the work to help them get to a point where they could be stable and they could be self-sufficient. And probably the best example of this flexible response is going to be in Berlin. So the Berlin crisis is going to take place in 1961. Now, between 1945 and 1950, over 15 million people defect from Eastern Germany through West Berlin. And so as a result of that, Stalin and then later Khrushchev are going to do what they can to more restrict that border between East and West Berlin, because really, ultimately, it was just a line on the ground that divided East and West Berlin, so anybody could walk across it, and people did every single day. People lived in Eastern Berlin but worked in West Berlin and vice versa, and well, sometimes people just didn't come home because things were so much better in Western Berlin that people just defected by going over to work and then never coming back to East Berlin. And so in 1958, the Soviets demand that Westerners get out of Berlin. Eisenhower ignores him. And so Khrushchev decides that he's going to wait until there's a new leader, somebody who seems a little less militarily strong as Eisenhower had been. And so when JFK comes in, he's like, this is perfect. And so he reiterates it to JFK. And he says, you are going to need to get out of Berlin immediately. If you do not, you will suffer the consequences. And because of this high level of defection from Eastern Berlin, they start increasing their numbers of military at the border, and so do we. And so JFK's response is, let's just put some more guys on the border to protect against any kind of aggression, but also try and protect those that might try and defect. And this is going to lead to a standoff at the border of Berlin, and that is the standoff at Checkpoint Charlie. Checkpoint Charlie was kind of the most iconic, best known crossing point between the East and West during the period of the Cold War. It kind of served as like a symbol of the Cold War itself and the division of East and West. Now, this standoff is going to quickly escalate. It goes from, increased soldiers standing there at the border to then we start bringing some jeeps in, and then tanks are brought in. And it's one of those things where we're just standing there eye to eye and playing chicken and waiting to see who blinks first. Eventually the Soviets backed down, and we thought, oh yay, this is a great victory. But we didn't realize that the reason that they were backing down is they were like, well, we're just forgetting this. We're not going to play this game anymore. We're not going to let anybody defect anymore. And 2 months later, they started to build the Berlin Wall. The Berlin Wall would start to be built in 1961, and it would be built surrounding the entire western side of Berlin. Not to keep the Westerners in, the Westerners could go anywhere they wanted to. Westerners had freedom of movement. It was the Easterners they were trying to keep out, and the Easterners were not allowed to go wherever they wanted to, and in fact, it was very difficult for Easterners to even travel from city to city. And so this was designed to prevent defection from the East. And as you can see from this picture, as time would go on, it would get more and more and more elaborate. It started off as just a concrete wall, and eventually it develops into this very elaborate system where we have, 24-hour guards, that we have barbed wire and electric wire, that we have these traps built in so that people might fall into them, and so on and so forth. And so as time would go on, it would get more and more elaborate in order to keep more and more people out of Western Berlin. Now, how do you think this looks to the Westerners? They feel like they are literally being caged in by the East, and they're looking at the United States, they're looking at the West, and they're like, what are you going to do? We are surrounded completely by the Soviets. We are surrounded completely by communism. Are you going to leave us alone? Because you can see in this picture, like Berlin, this little part of Western Berlin is in right smack dab in the middle of East Germany. And they're frightened that they're just going to get left behind and fend for themselves. That is why JFK goes to Western Berlin. And he goes to kind of boost their morale, as well as to kind of calm their fears, as well as give a warning to the Soviets that the U.S. will not abandon the Westerners of Berlin. While he's there, he tells this story that back in ancient times, all you had to do, you could travel anywhere in the world and not be molested, because all you had to say was, I am a Roman. And by saying that you were a Roman citizen, like nobody would mess with you, because you mess with one Roman citizen, you mess with the entire Roman Empire. Nobody wanted to do that. And he says, today America is the new Roman Empire. Today America is that nation that nobody messes with. However, although you are not in the United States, you have American backing. We will be there to support you. And he says a famous phrase. He says, Ich bin ein Berliner, which means I am a Berliner. And so he says to them, you tell anyone in the world that tries to mess with you that the President of the United States has said, Ich bin ein Berliner. I am a Berliner. I am one of you, and you are one of me, and we will defend each other. And so this is wildly supported by the people of the West. It is a statement to the Soviets that we will not back down. However, it continues to get more tense. So we have to go back actually a little bit down to Eisenhower's administration. And during his administration, there is a communist revolution that happens in Cuba. The U.S. backed quote-unquote democratic leader of Cuba, Fulgencio Batista, is overthrown by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. And they institute a communist government in Cuba, and they immediately sign a treaty of friendship between Cuba and the Soviet Union. And so this is going to allow for them to have more money flow as well as military protection. Castro suspends election, he jails and executes his opponents, he censors the press and the media, he takes over American businesses that were in Cuba. And so as a result, President Eisenhower orders a trade embargo, saying that the United States will not trade with Cuba, and we were one of their biggest trade partners. So we figured, well, monetarily, this is going to be a huge blow to them, so they'll start rethinking what they're doing. However, this is seen as an act of aggression by Cuba, and so they, kind of like double down on their efforts. Eisenhower then decides, well, okay, that wasn't working, and Fidel Castro doesn't seem to want to listen, so he puts together the Bay of Pigs invasion plan. Now, I just want to let everybody know there are no actual pigs harmed in this invasion, so everybody can just, take that worry off their minds. But what it was is it was a secret plan to overthrow Fidel Castro. They thought that we would be able to go in, invade, kind of do this, rapid fire, super quick, super surprise, and then overthrow Castro and be able to institute a democratic government. When Fidel Castro took over, there were a ton of very upset, very angry communist rebels or revolutionaries rather, that they didn't like the previous leader. They didn't like Bautista, but they didn't like Castro either, and they wanted to institute a new democratic government. And so they had escaped to the United States. And under Eisenhower's administration, we had not only trained them on how to be these rebel fighters, but we also helped give them supplies. And so they were trained and armed by the CIA in this invasion. However, Eisenhower leaves office and JFK comes in, and he agrees that he will go ahead with this plan. So we're going to have these Cuban rebels invade their own country and have them kind of help overthrow Castro, and then we will come in with air support to kind of like help blow up all the extra military bases so that Castro can't kind of retaliate. JFK agrees to this initially, but at the very last minute, he decides to pull air support. And the reason he does this is because he wants to make sure that the Soviet Union, who is now BFF with Cuba, doesn't see this as an attack on them and then retaliate against the United States. So as a result, we pull that air support, and so these rebels go in thinking they're going to get some backup by the U.S., and it doesn't come. And they are quickly overpowered by Fidel Castro and his men. They are captured, and most of them will be executed. And this is going to lay the groundwork for intensive distrust between the United States and Cuba, as well as the United States and the Soviet Union. Just a few months later, we are going to be flying over Cuba and spying on them, as we do, and we discover a whole bunch of nuclear missile sites that are on the island of Cuba. And we find out that they have gotten these missiles from the Soviet Union in order to, quote unquote, defend themselves against aggressor nations. Some of these missiles were fully operational, and many of them were pointed towards the United States, with abilities to reach every major city between Mexico and the United States. Now, clearly, who is probably going to be the target here? Obviously, the United States. And so this is the beginning of what is known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. JFK, for 13 days, is going to struggle with this. And in 13 days, this goes from a very kind of minimal thing to being the closest that we have ever gotten to actual nuclear warfare in American history. JFK, with flexible response, says, okay, you guys got nukes pointed at us. We know that you've got nukes pointed at us. We're going to form a blockade around Cuba. Nothing can come in, nothing will go out, and that way we can protect ourselves. However, he also, up to this point, has not alerted the American public. He wanted to see if he could maybe avoid this issue without causing any kind of mass hysteria. However, when the blockade does not seem to be having an effect on Cuba or the Soviet Union, who has ships heading towards the blockade and towards Cuba, JFK goes on television, and he goes on the air to not only inform the public, but to issue an ultimatum to the Soviet Union. And he says the following: "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." In other words, he says, ball's in your court. You know how mutually assured destruction works. If you want to be the first guy to test this, you're going to be the guy who started World War III, but we're going to be the guys who end it. And America, as we see these ships get closer and closer and closer to Cuba, we raise our DEFCON level, the Defense Readiness Condition level, all the way up to 2. This is on a 1 to 5 scale, 5 being the lowest, 5 being like everything's chill and no problems whatsoever. 1 meaning we've got our finger on the button and we're ready to push it. So we got up to DEFCON 2, which means the Air Force is ready for airstrikes and nuclear interception within 15 minutes notice. That means that we could actually have launched a nuclear weapon and have it land in Moscow in less than 45 minutes. And shockingly, we get no response from the Soviet Union. Now, the ships do turn around at the very last minute, and so we're able to avoid that crisis. However, the nukes are still in the Soviet Union, and Khrushchev isn't talking to us. What ends up happening? Khrushchev doesn't talk to Kennedy. Khrushchev goes on state media in Russia, and he says to the people that he is willing to take out the missiles in Cuba if the United States is willing to take its missiles out of Turkey. So it's interesting that he doesn't actually call Kennedy. He does this through his own country's news media. Kennedy agrees to remove all the missiles that were set in Turkey in exchange for Khrushchev removing the missiles in Cuba, and we are narrowly able to avoid nuclear warfare. Now, this kind of almost sounds a little anticlimactic, but this is extremely tense, and the nation was preparing itself for actual nuclear warfare between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the results of this, ladies and gents, and you can kind of see from this particular political cartoon, eye to eye, they blinked first. So when it came down to it, the United States and the Soviet Union, in this tense and, like world-ending situation, we made the ultimatum, and the Soviets are the ones that blinked first. What happens as a result? This damages Khrushchev's ability to rule in his country, that he is not able to stand up to the United States. And so he will be leaving office not too long after this. However, there is one positive thing that comes from it, and that is the Limited Test Ban Treaty. This would prohibit testing of nuclear weapons in outer space, underwater, and in the atmosphere. This came actually after a really long time of trying to create it. This had started off in the mid-1950s during Eisenhower's administration between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, because we were afraid that the nuclear arms race had reached a really dangerous level. And public protest about atmospheric testing and testing underwater had led to these talks. However, the talks just kept collapsing year after year after year. So finally, in August of 1963, representatives from the U.S. and the Soviet Union, as well as Great Britain, signed the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which would prohibit this type of testing. And it was seen as an important first step towards the control of nuclear weapons, which will allow for us to have an easing of tensions in the years after Kennedy's administration. So with John F. Kennedy, he's in office from 1961 to 1963. JFK is an appropriate abbreviated nickname that you can write on a test and everybody knows exactly who you're talking about. He's also known as the King of Camelot. His political party is Democrat, and the major events that happen under him is that he creates the Peace Corps, that they have the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, the Berlin Wall is built. We also have the first American in space, who is Alan Shepard, and we'll talk more about him in another class, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Limited Test Ban Treaty. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to add some more things on for John F. Kennedy when we get to the Civil Rights Movement, but there's a lot more that happens, so I didn't want to put them all on here yet. So save some room for JFK, and I will see you guys after spring break.